So SOE was set up to encourage resistance, carry out sabotage in enemy territory early in the Second World War, and it existed throughout the war. Now its job in Italy was to do the same thing, was to try to encourage resistance, carry out sabotage, contact resistance movements, send in agents, try to blow up key installations, key factories, things like this. Italy was an enemy country, not an enemy occupied one. Now the conditions that you found in places like France, Denmark, Low Countries, places like that, which had an occupied population. There was a population there who hadn't chosen the occupier, and the occupier was oppressive and had to keep control, often by force. Now the difference in Italy, of course, was that the fascists had been voted in. Mussolini was the elections hadn't been fair, but nevertheless Mussolini had been there by a popular choice, partly because the opposition had not been particularly strong, and there was a fear in Europe anyway of socialism and communism and these sorts of things. So for very strong reasons, fascism had been popular. And the problem that gave SOE, of course, was that here you had an enemy population. They weren't oppressed as such, not particularly, and certainly they weren't strongly aware of it. And there was a very strong propaganda machine, but there wasn't a population there that was in any way pro-Allied, if you like. Well, another obstacle is that Italy had had 20 years of suppressing internal opposition. They had a very strong secret police force. They had a very solid system of security and courts as well. And they'd had such a long time really of suppressing internal opposition, opponents, political parties and so on, and they dispersed many of them overseas. So SOE was approaching a country where the internal intelligence services had 20 years of experience really of demolishing precisely what SOE was trying to achieve. One of the movements that SOE tried to support in Italy was in Sicily, and it was the Mafia, which is quite unexpected. There are various conspiracy theories about the extent to which the Americans worked with the Mafia. And this story about how the British tried to work with the Mafia has just emerged really from the documents that I was looking at. It goes back quite far. It even predates the American interest in the Mafia. And SOE gave it very, very serious consideration and gave it serious thought and sought out contacts in New York and tried to establish contacts in Sicily as well. Well, another story that comes through is an assassination plot to kill Mussolini. This was completely unexpected. I didn't really expect to find this story. There is another theory that they killed him in 1945. There's no evidence really for that one. But in 1942, they did have a plan. And this one just emerges here and there in the archives, but there's a skeleton plan there certainly, and it's extremely entertaining to look at it and work out the characters who are involved. And what is also extraordinary is that a form of this plan was actually given the green light. Some of the techniques they were using in those days might strike us today as kind of quite basic, or perhaps even schoolboyish really. There were some agents who were recruited that really today wouldn't get past the vetting procedures, but in those days the vetting procedures were not as strong as they were today. It wasn't positive vetting in those days. It was very much negative, which means your name was washed against existing MI5 records, for example, and if there was no record of you there, then that's fine, then that's your vetting over. But these days, of course, they go in much more depth. There's one story where the British actually send certain material across the border from Switzerland into Italy, wrapped in a copy of the Daily Telegraph. Now, I think this was done as a signal to the Italians on the other side, as a kind of morale boosting thing, or perhaps as a joke. But nevertheless, if you're trying to send secret material over a border wrapped in a copy of the Daily Telegraph, if it falls into the wrong hands, then immediately one would suspect that you might be suspected of having contact with the British.